So let's start calculating employment figures. Now again, if you remember your definitions of whether people are employed, unemployed, or not in the labor force, this is a fairly straightforward section. First off, we have the unemployment rate. Now, the unemployment rate is essentially the number of people that are unemployed relative to those that would like a job. So the labor force is your employed plus your unemployed. The unemployment rate is the unemployed divided by the labor force. And of course, we're going to convert this into a percentage. We also have the labor force participation rate. So the labor force participation rate is the labor force divided by the adult population. And again, we're going to report this as a percentage. So this is an indication, in general, is a fairly good indication of the age of your population. Since most of the people who are unemployed are are retired, it means that the labor force participation rate gives a fairly good indication of how many, how old your population is. In general, an older population, meaning that there's a lot of older people in your population, an older population will have a low labor force participation rate. Whereas if you have a lot of young people in your society, the labor force participation rate will generally be high. So here we have the Canadian labor data. We see that we have about 28 million people in the adult population. And of this 28 million, we have 18.7 million in the labor force. This is approximately 66%. It's about 2/3 if you do a quick estimation. Not in the labor force, well, that's 1/3. So again, a lot of retired people coupled with, of course, a group of students that are not in the labor force, but again, mostly retired people. And then we have our unemployed, 1.39 million. So from this, of course, we can get our labor force participation rate more accurately, as well as our unemployment rate. Let's do an example using some fictitious, if we will, or some hypothetical data. From the data that we have here, we need to compute the labor force, the employment rate, or sorry, the unemployment rate, the adult population, and the labor force participation rate. Now, I should say it does not matter which order you actually do these questions. So you can calculate the labor force, the adult population, and then go with the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate. So do this in any order you like. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, there's multiple ways that you can get to these answers. But I'll give you a couple minutes here, or I guess you can pause the video and then do your calculations. When you've done your calculations, go ahead and continue with the video. All right, so hopefully you have your labor force statistics or your employment statistics calculated now. So here we go. We've got our labor force here. I'm going to take the number of employed, I'm going to add it to the number of unemployed, and we see that we've got 17,780.7. And what are we going to add? We're going to add 1325 to that, and we end up with 19,105.7 as our labor force. I'm going to go ahead and calculate the adult population right away. Again, like I say, we don't have to do it in the order that it's asked. So here I'm just going to take my labor force, since I've calculated it at 19,105.7, and I'm going to add it to those that are not in the labor force, 9,657.2. And this is going to give me an adult population of 28,762.9. Moving forward with the unemployment rate, this is where we have the unemployed, which is 1325, and I'm going to divide it by that by that labor force that I calculated earlier, 19,105.7. I'm going to convert that to a percent, which is of course 6.9%. And last, we have our labor force participation rate, which is going to be 19,105.7. So this is my labor force, employed plus unemployed. I'm going to divide that by my adult population, and we see that we have 66.4% of this population is in the labor force. So this would be very similar to Canada's distribution. So notice that the calculations are straightforward, and if you understand your definitions of labor force, unemployed, employed, and adult population, then the statistics that we calculate here are relatively easy to do. Next up, we're going to talk about the different types of unemployment. So here we go with a few more definitions. So we'll do that after a quick break.